And we're going to have to jump in there. And oh, incidentally, here guys, this is what your midterm's looking like. I got all this stuff tabulated, so that's what you'll get for midterm up there. You got your shop score where you can see it, and I've got your test scores where you can see it. If there's any tests that you think you've turned in that aren't showing up on that, then we'll pull your folder and see if they're in there, and you know, in case maybe Katie made a mistake or something. But anyway, let's move. Okay. Engine prepare 2 test 8. Normal battery drain for a vehicle with computer and electronic circuits is what?
20 to 30.
20 to 30 milliamperes. If it's over 50 milliamperes, then you're going to have too much drain, and it can kill a battery within a couple of days. This guy right here, this Cadillac out here, kills the battery in 5 hours. And that's what Daniel's supposed to be looking at over there. Sorry about the mess Daniel left on the table. Y'all need to fuss at him about that when he comes in.
Yeah.
Technician A says a discharged battery, which is lower than normal battery voltage, can cause solenoid clicking. Brrr. That's what it's talking about there. Technician B says a discharged battery or dirty corroded battery terminals can cause solenoid clicking.
Yeah.
Both of those people are right. You've heard that before. Huh?
Isn't that pretty much the same sentence?
Not really. We're talking dirty corroded battery terminal. Yeah, battery voltage versus cable. Slow cranking can be caused by all of these except what? A, engine mechanical problems. B, open neutral safety switch. C, corroded or dirty battery terminals. D, a lower discharge battery. Which one is not going to cause slow cranking?
An
open neutral safety switch keeps the starter from doing anything. If the starter turns slowly when engaged, a possible cause is what?
Warner defective starter.
Yeah, there you go. Warner defective starter. Number 5, an acceptable charging circuit voltage on a 12-volt system is 13.5 to 15.
That would be like 30,
13.5 to 15. Usually you're going to have 14 to 14.5 if you want to narrow that window. Sometimes on some cars, like it's got the, these halogen lights and all, if they overcharge for some reason or other, they can blow the lights. And occasionally you'll see one that lightning strikes and it'll blow all the bulbs on the car and stuff like that. I saw one lightning struck the antenna going down the road and it vaporized the antenna. It didn't even hurt the radio and destroyed the engine controller. It destroyed the engine controller, but it hit the radio antenna.
I would have had a heart attack.
Lightning does terrible stuff, but I mean, lightning will hit a vehicle going down the road. A lot of people claim that because you run tires and all that. Well, that's a bunch of hooey. That lightning can hit a vehicle when you're driving. Technician A says a voltage drop test of the charging circuit should only be performed when current is flowing through the circuit. Is that true?
Yeah.
That is true. Technician B says to connect the leads of the voltmeter to the positive and negative terminals of the battery to measure the voltage drop of a charging system? No. Number 6, that's going to be A. And then so number 7, testing the electrical system through the lighter plug using a digital meter can test what? Charging system voltage. You ever see one of them things that they give you a little battery thing you can plug into the lighter and just leave it plugged in while you're somewhere eating a burger or something? When you come back, it's supposed to bring the battery up. You can do that, but it's slow, All right. What happens? How is that possible? What happens is everything goes like this. If you've got a charged battery and an uncharged battery, if you hook them up, ultimately everything equalizes, right? Okay. All right. So let me see here. Technician A says voltage drop test the charging system. Let me back up. Technician A says the voltage drop test of the charging circuit should only be performed when current is not flowing through the circuit. That's wrong. Technician B says to connect the leads of the voltmeter to the positive and negative terminals to measure the voltage drop of the charging system. That's just like the other, in other words, anytime you measure voltage drop, you're supposed to stay on the same side of the system, like from negative to negative or from positive to positive, and be spinning the starter or flowing the load while you're doing it, whatever it is. During the load testing, battery voltage should not drop below how many volts?
Right?
Huh?
Was that neither?
Number 8 was actually a D, neither technician. During the load testing, battery voltage should not go below how many volts?
9.6.
We've kind of been here before. Number 10, this voltage reading was obtained while cranking the engine. This voltage reading was obtained while cranking the engine. Now, what kind of test is this that we're doing with this meter here?
That's a voltage drop.
That is a voltage drop test. And how is that? How does that look to you?
That looks bad.
Okay, what do you think? Is that too high?
Too high.
Okay, that's too high. Shouldn't be. It's 816 millivolts, which is almost a volt. What test is being performed in this illustration?
That's the alternator output voltage drop test.
Excuse me? Charging system voltage drop test.
Oh, that was my next guess.
Yeah. You know, you're right. That's the answer they put on there, but I don't like that answer. That's terrible. I don't know why they did that without consulting me. But basically, you gave it the right answer. I would not call it that. We call it see that even in the previous question, they were calling it the charging system voltage drop test. That's interesting. Okay. Second-rate amateur test riders. All right. Now, number 12, the primary, which is the low voltage ignition system, must be working correctly before any spark occurs from an ignition coil. Which of these components is not in the primary ignition circuit? A, spark plug wiring, B, pickup coil, C, ignition module, or D, ignition switch?
C.
A is secondary. Primary is always where the trigger is being popped and the work is done on the secondary. The primary is the trigger. Even on a relay, the coil is the primary and the load carrying terminal is the secondary, okay? Ignition module has direct control over the firing of the coils in the ignition system. Which component triggers or controls the module? A, crankshaft sensor, B, computer, C, pickup coil, D, all of the above. Actually, it should say any of the above. All of the above are not going to do that. Any of the above would be, which would be D, but not all of the above. Second-rate test rider here. Distributor ignition systems can be triggered by what? Hall effect sensor, magnetic sensor, spark sensor, either A or B.
I say A or B.
A or B, yeah. Number 15, ignition coil primary resistance is usually less than. Primary resistance is the two little wires that cause the coil to fire, not the one where the spark comes out. Ignition coil primary resistance is usually what?
150 to 1500.
Actually, it's less than 1 to 3 ohms. What? Yep, very, 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 it's almost a dead short.
At least you're trying here.
But on those E-core ignition coils, like you see on that board over there, it's supposed to be 0.3, and if you measure one that's 0.2, that coil won't fire. Isn't that interesting how that is? Okay. Let me see here. Coil polarity is determined by what? Direction of rotation of the coil windings. Now, I will tell you that on the E-core ignition coils, reversed polarity for a while during some of your model wasn't as big of a deal as it was if you hook the coil primary up backwards on some of your older ones, like the old oil field coils. It would have a weaker spark and wouldn't run right. Also, though, you can instantly tell that it's hooked up backwards if you put your scope on it and the scope pattern's upside down. That's a reverse polarity, My dad could actually look at the spark on one of the cars he was working on back whenever he had his shop. He could tell me. One day he pulled a spark plug and he looked at the spark and he said that coil polarity is reversed, and he swapped the wires around. I didn't see a lot of difference in the spark. He said, you got this on the outside and then you got a little tongue of fire on the inside, and the direction it's pointing tells you whether it's I couldn't see that, but my dad could see it. That was just amazing. He noticed stuff that a lot of other people didn't notice. That was just the way he was, All right. Let me see here. Compression sensing ignition uses what type of ignition?
Waste spark.
Waste spark. Now, how does it know? Listen to this. How does it know by the spark which cylinder is on exhaust and which one's on compression? If you got compression, what's going on in the cylinder that's got compression? You got gas and squeezed air in there. In the one that's on the exhaust stroke, there's no fuel in there, and there's no air being compressed, right? So you don't have any compressed air in there. And I will tell you, some of these ignition systems are weird, and that they'll shoot like 80 volts down there so that they can tell, by the way that 80 volts is going. Some kind of way I read about that. This is really crazy. And on some of these Hyundais or Kias and stuff, how they got these little coil packs, the little coil pack, kind of like when I got on that board up there. Did you know that you can, if you hook the wires up to the companion cylinders backwards, it can cause the engine not to run right because of this compression sense stuff? Because it's like having the cam sensor out of phase if you got the plug wires hooked up wrong. Just remember that. Always have them right. The pulse generator, blank, Is A, used as a tachometer reference signal by the computer and has no other function? B, signals the computer that fires the spark plug directly? C, fires the spark plug directly? Or D, signals the electronic control unit? That's D. Two technicians are discussing coil on plug ignition systems. Technician A says they can be called coil near plug or coil bi-plug ignition system. Technician B says some can use ion sensing. And that's going to be C, both of them. Yeah, that basically is something like I was talking about, how it's got voltage down there and it wants to see. It basically they're trying to figure out a way to get away from the chem sensor. See if the spark plug is in there and they can figure out a way for the spark plug to tell if it's on compression or exhaust, you know, then they'll know automatically which cylinder is what. Let's see, a waste spark ignition system fires what? Two spark plugs at the same time. But wait a minute. That's a crazy mixed up. One spark plug with forward polarity, one spark plug with reverse polarity, two spark plugs at the same time. Believe it or not, that's C, which C is in the wrong place.
Yes, it is.
All of the above should be D, not C. Got me? That's a mixed up. That's basically all of the above, because it does fire. And I'm going to tell you something else. Let me hit you with this. If you pull the spark plugs out of one that's got, you know, really old spark plugs in it, and they've been there a long, long time with a lot of miles on them, and you know you've got one set of wires firing over here, one set of wires firing over here. Those plugs, the ground electrode will be worn off of some of the plugs, and the center electrode will be worn off the others. You know, because of the way that the spark consistently jumps. You know, so if you may see 4 plugs that look different from the other 4, but they're all the same age and they've been in there the same amount of time. You see that? I mean, just watch for that, because it doesn't mean that somebody only changed 4 of them and didn't change the other ones. You got me? And usually, if you see a paint spot on top of the spark plug up here, it typically means that the spark plug has never been changed. All right, let me come on down here now. Let's see, where are we at here? 22. 21. Technician A says that effective crankshaft sensor can cause a no spark condition. Is that true or is that false?
That's true.
Technician B says a faulty ignition control module can cause a no spark condition.
That's
You're
true.
right about that. If it has an ignition control module, most of them are operated by the PCM nowadays. Technician A says inductive ignition systems supply battery voltage to the positive side of the ignition coil and pulse the negative side of the coil on and off to create a high voltage spark. Technician B says if an ignition system uses a distributor, it's called a distributor or DI ignition system. Which one is right about that? That's going to be both of them there. Which of the because of blank, an ignition coil cannot be fully charged until after a delay of about 10 milliseconds. Ooh, that's a hard question, isn't it? That principle is called inductive reactance. That's my boring video voice. Inductive reactance. Inductive reactance. Yes. And a knock sensor is basically a tuned accelerometer. But, yeah, it's a tuned accelerometer, a knock sensor is. Okay, Technician A says a pickup coil can be tested with an ohmmeter. Technician B says ignition coils can be tested with an ohmmeter. Which technician is correct? They can, but if you can test an ignition coil with an ohmmeter, and it can test within specs, but that doesn't necessarily mean the coil is good, particularly if you're checking the secondary part of it. I'm all about a go, no-go test, you know what I mean? It's one of those, if it fails, it is bad, but if it don't fail, I don't mean it's good. Technician A says a thorough visual inspection should be performed on all ignition components when diagnosing an engine performance problem. I would say that he's probably right on target with that, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Let's see, Technician B says platinum spark plug can be regapped after use in an engine. That is A.
Yeah.
A. Alright. Technician A says a defective spark plug wire can cause an engine miss. Technician B says a defective spark plug can cause an engine miss. Duh. Both of those people are right. Now, one of the ways that I like to try to find defective spark plug wires is I take some 409 or some soapy water and I spray on the wires, and if they see lightning start popping out and the engine starts skipping, then I know that I got a bad plug wire. That doesn't, if you spray on there and they don't like pop lightning, that doesn't mean they're good. It just means they're not leaking spark. You can have one that's burned off up in there where it's not able to get the spark to the plug. That won't show it, but you can actually test that. I like to pull the wires off and look in them. If you look in the end of a spark plug wire and it looks all dusty and burnt, then that plug wire is typically bad. And you can measure it with a meter. It's supposed to be 5,000 ohms per foot. If you measure it with a meter, with your meter on the 25,000 or 20,000 ohm scale, and you don't get anything, you know, you got to be touching the metal. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. You're supposed to have like 5,000 ohms per foot. The longer the wire, the more resistance you got. That resistance is good. You're not supposed, you know what, you ever wonder why they don't just use plain old wire for spark plug wires instead of that carbon fiber stuff? You ever wonder about that? Back years ago, you could buy rolls of spark plug wire that had metal core in it, made by Delco. And I bought a roll of that stuff from the parts house. And I bought me a bunch of ends, and I had some pliers, and I could just build plug wires with reckless abandon. And so this guy had this 66 Chevrolet pickup truck. He was over my dad's shop, and I built a set of plug wires for it. Man, those things were so pretty and all that stuff. But they worked. That engine started up, but every radio for a half a mile in every direction went.
That's funny.
And if the FCC happened to come by there, they'd come and pound that darn truck and put me in jail. It's basically for noise suppression. It doesn't cause radio suppression, because anytime you've got, you know, spark popping, it's going to create radio signals. It's going to be picked up by your radio. You know, wow. And so basically they have these, the spark plugs and the wires are designed to keep you from having any kind of a naked spark at all. You know the tune-up grease that you put in the spark plug wire to snap on the plug? Part of the reason for that is it's dielectric grease. It does not conduct electricity in any way, shape, or form, and it forces the spark to only flow through the places where the metal is touching. If you've got any spark making lightning in there, it's going to create some radio frequency interference, RFI they call it. So basically we're all about not interfering with people's radios. You got me? Okay.
Does it affect your own?
Huh?
Does it affect your own?
It affect my what?
Your own radio.
Oh yeah, in a big way. As a matter of fact, you know the little carbon button that's in your distributor cap that the rotor rides against? That little carbon button, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
There was this girl named Katie, different, not the Katie that does my work, but a different one. She came over here and she had her little Blazer, S10 Blazer, and it was making a radio noise. And so how do you find a radio noise like that? You know, with the engine running, it would follow the tape player didn't do it. I mean, the CD player or whatever, but the radio did. And so what we did was, I said, we got it really loud where we could hear it. And then I said, okay, we're going to unplug the alternator. That didn't change anything, still did it. Well, if it's the alternator doing it, you got to replace the alternator, right? Alternator wasn't doing it. So I said, okay, now we're going to kill the ignition system. But while it was going, I pulled the primary part of the ignition, just shut the ignition system down, and it went away. Okay, so I pulled the distributor cap off, and that little carbon button had fell out of the distributor cap and was rolling around down in that top of that rotor. And the spark, as it was coming into the center of that cap from the coil, had to jump about 1/4 of an inch, and it was creating RFI. So we put another distributor cap on there, and she was in Fat City. That's all it took, the distributor cap, to get her radio frequency. But if you hear spark popping, we used to have this situation at when I was working at Ford Place. What we would do is if you turn the AM radio to the low end of the AM band, and you're thinking maybe there's some sort of electrical interference somewhere that's causing the car to do things, you drive it down the road with that static on that radio going like that. If something happens, you know, if you feel whatever you're feeling and you're hearing a lot of scratchy stuff that goes along with it in the radio, you know it's some sort of an RFI problem that's causing it. You know, it's actually, and RFI can confuse the computer into thinking that there's, you know, renegade signals. In other words, it's just garbage in, garbage out kind of thing. You know, it gets a signal that it doesn't know what to do with because it's induced in the wires going into the computer. You got a little scratchy spike coming in on that wire, and the computer says, oh no, this means I'm supposed to do whatever with the ignition timing or the fuel injection, and you know, you get bucking and jerking. Doesn't always mean there's a bad component. Sometimes it means you got interference coming in. And that's why the low end of the AM band. The Vietnam War area pilots had the way I understand it, had a low end of the AM band radio all the time, it was on in their cockpit in their headphones, and if somebody painted them with a surface to air missile radar, they're all static, and they were being targeted. See, and that's how that is really sensitive to any kind of interference, and that's how they would do that, you know. Muffled squawking sound in here. Anyway, I got off on something. But that's all ignition related, right? What number are we on?
27.
27. Which of these components sends a pulse signal to an electronic ignition module? Pickup coil. Number 28. Typical secondary coil resistance specifications usually range. This is secondary, not primary now. We had one about primary earlier. Which one?
6,000 to 30,000.
Everybody like that? 6,000 to 30,000 sounds good to me. Technician A says the primary coil has more windings. Technician B says the secondary coil has more windings. And that's both of these are parts of the ignition coil. Which has more windings, secondary or primary?
Secondary, right?
Secondary's got lots and lots and lots and lots of windings. If you ever, and I'm not saying you should, because the oil in these oil-filled coils is extremely poison, but if you ever grind into one of those oil-filled coils and you pull those things out of there, that copper wire for that secondary winding is really, really, really fine, like thread. I mean, it is so tiny. As a matter of fact, you could stretch a strand of it across the door and somebody'd walk through it like a spider web and didn't even know it was there. You know, if you just walk in looking past it. I used to do that to my sister. I'd stretch it across the door and she'd walk through it, you know. But anyway, I'd grind into those coils and get that wire out and unwind it. It was just fun. Although, like I say, don't do that and get that stuff in your bloodstream, because you could surely die. Let's see. Technician A says an engine will likely misunderload if the ignition coil is tracked. Incidentally, this spark plug has got a track on the side of the ceramic. And when you see a carbon track on the side of the ceramic, there will also be a corresponding carbon track on the inside of the plug wire. And if you do not replace the plug wire when you replace the wire, it's going to come back and it's going to be skipping the same way. So if you see a carbon track on the side of the wire that's, you know, looks like somebody drew it on there with a little marker or something, that means that the spark plug has got too much resistance, and this one here is worn completely out. It's just about burned completely off. And the spark on them, particularly on this coil pack ignition, is going to look for somewhere else to go. Distributor ignition won't typically do this. Coil pack ignition will. And if it's running down the outside of that plug, it means it's got really high resistance in the plug. You need to replace the plug and that wire, or a set of wires. I'd done it when I first saw that. I thought, this yo-yo put his own plugs in and he cracked them, and I just put some more plugs in, and he came back a couple of days later skipping again, and it had carbon tracks on the inside of the wires. So you'll see the carbon track in the boot, and it's going to try to follow that carbon track. You don't do that, but that's why I keep that plug laying up there so I can weave it around and talk about that. Let me see. Technician B says the one wire of a waste spark coil must be grounded. That's actually A. Now, some of the guys that were right after this waste spark coil pack ignition came out, and we were at school, one of the guys was trying to act like that if you pulled one of the plug wires off, the other one would quit firing because it has to be a full loop for it to ground. But that's exactly not true. You can pull one of them and only that one will misfire. But what will happen is occasionally you'll get a misfire code that you think is on cylinder number 5 or whatever, and it'll be on that companion cylinder. You know what I mean? You'll think that it's on 5. It'll lie to you about which cylinder it's on. You'll pull number 5, the plug will look good, everything will seem fine, and you'll be really confused. Then you go to 2 or whatever on that particular engine, whatever the companion is, which is the one that's coming up at the same time, and you'll find out that 2 was the bad one. So don't get thrown by that. If you're looking for 5 and it's a different one, or 3 or 4 or whatever, make sure that you check both that one and its companion when you get a misfire code, particularly if the plot thickens and you can't figure out what's going on. Let's see, so number 30 basically is A. Number 31, Technician A says to use a normal spark plug when checking for spark. Technician B says that a spark tester should be used to check for spark. Who is correct about that? That's going to be a B. Actually, whenever I've checked for spark, I've just used a pocket screwdriver or whatever I happen to have on hand. If you're out there somewhere. This one guy that I was working with went out there and he says, I went out there and the sunlight was so bright that I couldn't tell if I had spark or not. You know how when the sun's bright you just can't see anything? And I said, well, you need an SST. He said, what are you talking about? I said, the shaded spark tester. Hadn't you ever heard of that? I made that up, but he bought into it. Okay. All right, let me see here. Well, it's a very good plan. Hey, somebody needs to invent that.
Well,
Think about it, a shaded spark tester. You know, a spark tester, you can use in bright sunlight so that it got a little dark chamber where the spark's happening, where you don't get confused from the
How
sunlight.
many people are actually going to buy that?
Huh?
How many people would actually buy
People that had run into a situation where they couldn't see the spark because of about, hey, I'm going to have one of those. You know, that's what you design one really easy. That's your job. I want you to come up with a shaded spark tester, and you'll have to stick out your tongue to test it. All right, let me see here. Let's see. Diagnostic trouble code P0301, which is a misfire on cylinder 1, is on a waste spark system, could be caused by all of these except A, defective spark plug, B, defective pickup coil, C, open spark plug wire on cylinder number 4, which is the companion to cylinder number 1, or D, open plug wire on cylinder number 1. It's not going to be a defective pickup coil that's going to cause that. However, remember what I told you, I had a cam sensor. I had the profile ignition pickup in a distributor on a Tempo. It had a cam sensor on it, and they did away with that little narrower vane. And this thing, whenever I was cracked the throttle, it would drop cylinder number 3. And in that particular case, it confused the PCM, which wasn't programmed for that profile ignition pickup. Somebody the car was in an accident. Boom! It broke the distributor. They actually got one out of the parts room. It was supposed to fit that Tempo. And when they put it in there, it had the profile ignition pickup, which was a narrower vane, but it was a 92 model. It also had the cam sensor. And so it was expecting all the vanes to be the same size. And it was really confusing to me because I put the scope on it, everything's fine idling, but you crack the throttle, cylinder number 3 would drop out. And I was just, and then when I figured out what was going on, all I had to do was change out that little vane cup. On that one, you could do that. They had the old distributor over there that let me rob it out of it, and it fixed it. But I'm telling you, it'll smack you around if you're not thinking clearly. Now, no start condition is being described on an engine equipped with waste spark ignition. Technician A says a bad crank position sensor could be the cause. Technician B says an open spark plug wire could be the cause. Technician A. Let me go so far as to say, too, that if you're in a situation, you want to be, what you're going to shoot for, what you want to be, is you want to be the guy that other people come to for answers. You don't want to be the guy that's always going to other people for answers. You know what I mean? If you're the guy that's always going to other people for answers, yeah, grab your ticket off my desk. You're ready to go. You just pay and go.
I'm already paid.
Oh, well, take it then, man. You found your key?
I have it with me.
Huh?
It's in there?
It's in my,
Okay.
You got it. That's right. In my office. All right. Identify the type of ignition system shown in this diagram. My train of thought was interrupted, but you got my point. Got me?
Got it.
What is that? What type of ignition system is shown in that diagram? Hmm?
Well, that's
I didn't
waste
say
spark
coil
ignition.
plug.
That's the waste spark ignition system. Look at this peculiarity. Look at that system the way it's wired. Are the primary and the secondary sides of that connected to each other at any place?
No.
Those windings aren't touching either anywhere. That's different from the one where you got a regular coil. All right. Now identify the type of ignition system shown in this diagram.
That's coil on plug.
That's the coil on plug. Now what's the difference on coil on plug and coil near plug?
Coil on plug is on the plug, and the coil near the plug is near the plug.
We got one out here. We got a coil near plug on the lot.
Yeah.
What?
That's neon.
No, that's coil pack.
Ranger.
No, that's not it either. Which vehicle do we have that's coil near plug? It's got one coil for every cylinder, but the coil is not on the plug. GMC, that's right. You got a little short plug wire about that long. You remember that because you had to bust your fanny changing out some of them the other day, didn't you? That was a booger bear. He had to buy a set of plug wires for that Suburban, and they were, these spark plugs like this one I showed you that's got that smooth ceramic that don't have the little ridges? That will vulcanize, that plug wire will vulcanize to that, and it is an absolute booger bear to get that thing off there. And if you ever see any to have somebody, you might as well sell them some wires right up front, man, because you're going to rip that thing to shreds trying to get it off there usually.
Okay, coil on plug don't have a spark plug wire, right?
No.
Alright, coil near plug has spark plug wire.
A short one, but it's got one coil for each spark plug, but a little short wire. Like that GMC's got a little short wire about that long going from the coil down to the plug. And it's got 8 coils. It's the number of coils and where they are that calls it coil near plug. Coil near plug's like the GMC. Coil on plug's like the Crown Vic.
And that one
like your F-150, but not the one you're working on now. That one's the coil pack.
That one's coil
That one's
pack.
it's got two coil packs.